Welcome to Grace Fellowship Baptist Church Wednesday evening Bible study for September 16th, 2020. Tonight is Saturday night, September 12th, 2020, and tonight we're starting in Luke chapter 23, verse 26, if you'll follow with me as I read. As they led him away, they seized Simon from Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country, and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned and said to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, 'Blessed are the barren women, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' And then they will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if men do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Two other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, where they crucified him along with criminals, one on his right, the other on his left, Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others, let him save himself if he is the Christ of God, the chosen one." The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was a written notice above him which read, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God," he said, "since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus answered him, "I tell you the truth, today you will be with me in paradise." Luke deals simply with the crucifixion. He's testifying to people who understand crucifixions, who it's an art form that they honor. It's down to science. They know how to prolong it. They know how to shorten it. They know how to make it more agonizing. They've done a lot of work to try to figure this out, and they are pretty good at it. And Luke does not need to deal with those kind of details with the Romans because they know them. When they hear the crucifixion, they will be able to draw up legally all of the information that they need. So he's dealing with the things the Romans wouldn't know about the crucifixion. And he's dealing with the other aspects that prove who Jesus was, that he was indeed the Son of God. Starts off with what shape was Jesus physically? Well, the Romans normally made the condemned man walk through the streets naked, carrying his own cross. It was part of his shame, part of his punishment. If they considered him unable to carry the cross, then they would grab a bystander and tell him he was going to carry the cross for the condemned man. The condemned man would still proceed through the town naked. That didn't change. So the Romans considered Jesus incapable of carrying the cross. Now, this was the same man that 3 years before was a carpenter. He was strong physically, carrying two beams of wood, even fairly large beams and that long, would not have been impossible for Jesus as a healthy adult. That tells you something about how badly he was beaten. It told the Romans something about how badly he was beaten. Just a few verses before, Luke had said that Pilate's men beat him, the Jewish guards had beat him, Herod's men beat him, and so a bunch of people had beat him. And so the Romans get the idea that Jesus is in pretty bad shape, um, that he'd actually been beat well beyond what a Roman citizen would have been allowed to have been beat before he was crucified. Um, Romans, uh, as a whole, took pride in never beating somebody who was going to be crucified very much because the torture was the crucifixion, not the beating beforehand. Um, Pilate and Herod both probably thought he was not going to be crucified. That's why they allowed their men to beat him. That the Jewish authorities hoped he would be crucified. That they allowed their men to beat him. It just says something about their hearts. Um, they obviously didn't do much damage, or Pilate would have done things differently. They probably left bruises, but no serious wounds. Um, Pilate's men would have probably been there to do a standard flogging, skin broken, lots of blood loss, um, definitely bruising, probably no broken bones. Herod's men probably did the same quality of job, but already on somebody who'd already been beat again for the first time. Um, so he's in pretty bad shape. Um, and so the Roman guards, whose job was to do the crucifixion, and that was a profession in the Roman army. It was a separate calling. Basically, once you were a crucifixioner, you could move up the ranks. You could become a centurion over the crucifixioners. You could become an officer over the centurions, etc. There was only so high you could go with that kind of past unless you ended up going back into a battle position where you led men into battle. But very few men actually did. For one thing, it was a fairly honored and considered uh, an honorable. It was well paid. It's considered a much preferred job if you were going to be a legionnaire. It was a tough job in one sense, being an executioner and being the one who executed people through torture. Um, but it was also a publicly honored job in that you were carrying out the will of the government. You were not doing your own will. Uh, this the Roman army did have people who tortured people to extract information, and sometimes just to torture them because uh, they couldn't get away with crucifying them for some reason, and they wanted them to severely hurt. And they did have people in that. Those were not well looked up at, too. They were kind of like our current CIA agents that do the same kind of thing. They stayed hidden. Everybody pretended nobody knew who they were. Um, they were viewed as not being in good shape. And you may see me try to slap a few mosquitoes tonight. I apologize. I have way too many in the house tonight. Um, these men were professionals at crucifixion, and they knew when somebody was capable and when they weren't. And that they grabbed somebody out of the crowd to carry the cross, said, in their professional opinion, Jesus was incapable of carrying the cross. That they got to the crowd means Jesus did carry it for some distance, because the crowd wasn't all the way up to the uh, citadel where he would have been before. So he may have carried it a mile, mile and a half, something like that. Um, about a 5 to 6 mile trip that he would have had to do. And so they'd seen him in carrying it and knew he was incapable of carrying it the whole way. They did not want a man to collapse on the way and be incapable of being crucified. That was an embarrassment to them in their profession. So when time came and somebody was incapable, they in turn then grabbed somebody out of the crowd. In this case, we know the name of the man, Simon of Cyrene. We know a little bit more about him than what Luke tells us, because in Paul's writings, he mentions Simon's sons. And so we know that he was an early believer, and his sons became prominent leaders. And, likely part of that becoming a Christian later is Simon knew what Jesus had gone through and heard the news that he had been raised from the dead, that God had raised him from the dead, uh, became convinced that this indeed was the Messiah. Um, Jesus' followers and people who admired him followed Jesus. The women were weeping. Um, there were people who professionally mourned, um, and if they did not have a paying job to mourn, it was fairly common for them to mourn behind those who are being executed, um, so to speak, as professional practice for people to see how well they mourned, things like that. But it was also a public testimony that somebody was being executed. And this is very likely who Jesus is talking to. It could have been of some of his disciples, that the women that followed him and paid for things and that are mentioned elsewhere. Uh, it could have been just general townswomen who were mourning for him, that thought he was a prophet, a good man, even the Messiah, and mourning that he was going to be killed. Um, anyway, at that, Jesus gives this prophecy: don't mourn for me, don't weep for me, mourn and weep for yourself, because the time will come when you ask the mountains to fall on you. This prophecy is echoed in the revelation that John had. And at the end times, the people will still be rebelling against God. And because of the punishment of their sins upon the world, the curses put upon the world by God, they will be asking the mountains to fall on them and kill them instead of repent and turn and follow God. Um, I'm not sure whether Jesus is referring to this, what's still yet in the future prophecy, or if he's making a reference that he will be giving that prophecy to John later, um, or whether John, when he gets that, realizes, hey, wait, I heard that at the crucifixion. Some of those things are kind of interesting. Um, and then he says, if men do these things to the tree when it's green, what will happen when it's dry? Um, he's referring to a Aramaic idiom that basically, if people are going to do that when, um, damage a living tree, what would they do to a dead tree? Was the uh, gist of it. But it meant, if people are doing that when somebody's strong, what will they do when he's weak? Um, you know, thing is, Jesus is at, so to speak, his weakest at this point. Um, but he's fixing to be, in 3 days, his strongest. Um, he was capable at this point of stopping it, but he was going to do the Father's will. And he was not going to fail to do what he'd been sent to do. So he was being obedient to his Father and going to the crucifixion, going to sacrifice himself as the Lamb of God to forgive the sin of the world. And then he was going to raise himself again on the third day so that we would know he was Lord of Lords and King of Kings, that he was capable of it all. The people around him, though, needed to know that this was, going to happen. And yes, in certain times later, the same people are going to be persecuting Jesus' disciples, his followers, and much of that tale is started in the book of Acts. We'll get to that next. I've already started my study of Acts, and we're going to cover it next because I think it makes sense to, after we cover Luke, finish Luke's writings in the book of Acts and see how the thought continues and how they go together as two books that tell one tale. So that's where we're going next, if you want to know. Romans also normally did not crucify one person by himself. They basically, if they found somebody worthy of being crucified right now, they went in the jailhouse and found everybody else that had been sentenced to be crucified, and they did everybody at once. Sometimes they did symbolic crucifixions of certain groups of people and left others behind to do another time. But security in their jails was not as good as it is in ours, and so they tended to go, well, who all has been condemned to be crucified? Okay, get them all out here, or we don't have to guard them anymore. We're going to crucify one today, we're going to crucify them all. And so they went in the jails, and there was only two. And so they put one on either side of Jesus. And those two were criminals who had done their crimes and been punished, and by the testimony of one of them, they were properly punished, righteously punished, to be crucified. They knew their crimes were worthy of that when they did them, and they did them anyway, and they got caught, and they got convicted, and now they're fulfilling their punishment. They knew the risk, they took it anyway, they got caught. One of them was still a sinner, still unconcerned with authority, and was taunting Jesus. He was still being just like he'd always been, apparently. The other one, though, recognized in Jesus that Jesus was innocent, that he was likely to be the Messiah, and he's looking for mercy. He got no mercy from the Roman court, and now he's looking kind of at mercy from the court of last resort. The Romans weren't going to give him any mercy, and he asked to be remembered when you come into your kingdom. He's basically asking for some sort of favor, asking that God bless him in some way. He's, in one sense, kind of resigned to, I'm worthy of going to hell, but make my hell a little less worse, kind of thing. The Jewish concept of the afterlife was not as well developed as we have today. Those who believed in it kind of believed that all the dead went to a place of the dead. Sheol was the Hebrew name. And it was just a place where dead people were. They were still alive in death, but they were in this place and could do nothing, basically. And they were basically in storage. And they had no real concept of whether the place of the dead was eternal or just short-lived, or whether it was punishment or neutral or heaven. Um, it was just where you went after you died. And so their concept of the afterlife was not very well developed. Um, and that's essentially the view that the Old Testament gives. There's a place where you go after you die, Sheol, and they didn't know much about it. Nobody come back from the dead. Nobody could tell them what it was like. God hadn't told anybody. Um, it takes the revelation of Jesus and his disciples in the New Testament for us to have any information about what the afterlife is like. And even today, a lot of what we think we know and what we believe about the afterlife is conjecture, people's thoughts, people's um, logical conclusions from the little bit Jesus and his disciples did tell us. I suspect much of it is wrong, um, just like the Jewish conception was wrong. I suspect that we've missed lots of things that either we don't know and God didn't bother telling us, or he told us and we just missed the significance of it. And so I'm going to be plan to be pleasantly surprised. Uh, we do know certain things about it, but this criminal is basically asking that, you know, when Jesus goes to paradise, goes to heaven, that he gets a little more consideration. Um, Jesus does a whole lot more than that, because Jesus does understand eternity in the way even we don't. He knew there was a heaven and a hell. Those who believed in him would end up in heaven. Those who didn't would end up in hell. Uh, Hell is eternal destruction, eternal death. Heaven is eternal life, uh, eternal reward. And he tells the man, "You will be with me in paradise, in heaven." In other words, the man, for believing that he is the Messiah, is going to be the first person in heaven. Um, Kind of an interesting thought. Even in his death, Jesus was pointing out that it's not our morality that matters for getting to heaven. Because this man was immoral. By his own testimony, he's justly being crucified, and that it's right for him to be crucified. Um, the Romans didn't crucify people for just being annoying. Uh, you generally had to do a high political crime, attempt assassination, or you had to kill somebody, or, assassination or overthrow the government and fail. Um, you had to kill somebody, or have credible attempt to kill somebody, like being part of a insurrection. Um, or you had to have multiple heinous crimes such as rape, torture, things like that, and particularly of a Roman citizen. Um, Now, if you were a non-Roman citizen, there was more leeway. The Roman judges could crucify you for less than that, but they also risked some likelihood of censure, that higher authorities would say, no, you did that one wrong. Of course, if it's a Roman citizen, they would generally slap them on the wrist. If it caused a local riot or whatever, you'd be put on trial. If you were convicted, you'd be moved to a different jurisdiction, but you generally wouldn't get as nice a one as you had currently. Um, and so that Pilate had been put back, he had been acquitted of any wrongdoing, but he had also been slapped on the wrist, fined some money, told that if anything messed up again, he was out. Um, and he wasn't wanting to upset the Romans, and he crucified what he knew was an innocent man. That's, you know, uh, he's pushing the border here. Um, and probably the only reason he did it is he was afraid he was going to have a riot on his hands for the second year in a row. He probably wasn't really interested in that. So Pilate also, like a fairly common Roman custom, when somebody was crucified, what crime they did was put above the cross, so as to be a deterrent for those who would think they would do that crime. Um, and you know, if you publicly see an execution and the charges against the man are written above him, it does have some chilling effect on whether you're going to do that crime, whether you're going to plan to do that crime. Um, Interesting enough, the charge against Jesus was not one that was directly improper in the Roman hierarchy. The Jews could have a king as long as the king bowed to the emperor. The implication was that Jesus didn't bow to the emperor. The message Pilate was trying to say to the commoners is, look, last year I had an insurrection. I crucified 100 of you. Y'all caused a riot and a bigger ruckus, and I had to go to Rome and defend myself. And now you've handed me your king, and we're putting a stop to this. This is what happens when you do an insurrection. You get crucified. He's trying to send this message to calm the people down and make them realize it's just better to enjoy the economic prosperity that Rome brings and live in peace and not try to uh, overthrow the Roman government because of religious reasons. Um, that's what Pilate's trying to say. The Romans would have enjoyed that joke because they would have viewed somebody who was the king of the Jews as either Herod the Great, the last king of the Jews they recognized, or somebody doing insurrection. And hey, if you're really doing insurrection, yeah, you need to be crucified, and we're done. And Pilate may have also been doing an inside joke, been convinced that indeed Jesus was a religious king, not a political king, and he was indeed the king of the Jews. And knowing that Jesus could have stopped it and let him be crucified anyway and put his title up there. All kinds of ways to interpret that. The charge normally over the prisoner was either a fairly simple one, murder, rape, a single word that conveyed the whole story, or it was a paragraph describing your whole crime and what you did and what the evidence was and why you were convicted and who convicted you when, and a, a small essay describing how heinous you were. That Pilate went to the middle length is the odd thing. He didn't give a complete sentence, but it wasn't just a 1 or 2 word description either. That was kind of almost never done. You either did a 1 or 2 word description of the worst parts of the conviction, or you told all the details and put it up there. And Pilate did neither one. So that's kind of an interesting difference. And, then there's the reaction of the crowd. The crowd is making fun of him. They're, of course, being egged on by the Jewish leaders. And The Jewish leaders are making fun of him. Uh, his disciples are distraught, but can't, of course, calm the whole crowd down. The soldiers that crucified him, part of their job was to humiliate people. And if you get practice at it all the time, you get pretty good at it. And so they're making fun of Jesus also. They're doing their jobs, so to speak. Um, and it appears from Luke's account that the whole world was making fun of Jesus. We know from the other Gospels that some of the disciples were there, at least John, uh, some of the women, you know, and they obviously weren't. They were the people weeping and being concerned, but they were also being witnesses to what happened. And, you know, so it was a fairly typical Roman crucifixion. The crowds were there. It was a public place. Um, the place of the skull was just outside the city. Romans normally did not crucify people within a city, uh, but it was also normally on a main road. And uh, the hill that was known as the skull uh, was a kind of a cliff over one of the main roads. And so people going down the road could see the crucifixion. It was visible from fair long distance away. And people, as they approached on the road, were basically even with it at the top of the hill, and they could see the crucifixion because crucifixion was lifted up and you could see it from a fair amount away. And so the Romans had picked a fairly visible spot on the way out of Jerusalem to crucify people, and the place got the name the skull. Um, Golgotha in Aramaic, Calvary in Latin. Um, you know, it's the place of the skull. It's the place the Romans did crucifixions. Um, we don't know anything about whether the name was attached to it after they started crucifying people there, or if it had the name of the skull and the Romans go, that's a good place to crucify people, and it's visible, and yeah, it's ideal. Let's do it. All we basically know about it is Jesus was crucified there. Um, so, you know, very picturesque naming of the hill that the Romans did so many crucifixions on. 1 year before, 100 men had been crucified in that spot. Uh, Roman history has lots of people crucified in Jerusalem, and that would have been the place they did it. Um, so, you know, Luke was pointing out that Jesus was in Roman hands and being uh, crucified by Roman hands. He wasn't any more under the authority of the Jewish leaders. He was now in Roman hands. Romans did the crucifixion. And so there's a lot there, and Luke sketches it very simply because the Romans just needed to know the crucifixion was carried out, and Jesus was in bad shape, but he was still talking, he was still coherent, he was able to talk with the people around him, and offer comfort to the women of Jerusalem, and warning, offer comfort to the uh, thief on the cross next to him that believed in him, and even promised that he would be in heaven that day. Now, that's another significant prediction. Romans did not let somebody die the first day when they were going to be crucified. If they were going to kill them the same day, they used a spear or a sword and they just ran them through and we're done with you. If we're going to do this fast, we don't go to the bother of putting up a cross and hanging you on it to do you quickly. The Romans meant for you to be up there for days or weeks. The longest Roman recorded crucifixion lasted over 3 weeks, with somebody up there continuously on the cross. Um, More typical was about 3 or 4 to 5 days. Um, People normally died of asphyxiation when they got too tired to hold themselves up. Some of them died of thirst and exposure, um, overheating or freezing, being chilled. Um, Romans did not try to keep you from sunburning or from being too cold. Uh, if that was the weather conditions, well, that's what God's decreed for you. Kind of was the Roman view. Uh, if gods were merciful to you, you might freeze to death on the cross. So that Jesus is predicting this healthy man next to him on the other cross is going to be dead today. The Romans would have been like, no, we're better at our craft than that. He's going to hang up there 3 to 5 days at least. We're going to make this last. It was supposed to be torturous and long lasting. That Jesus said, "You're going to be with me in paradise today." You know, the Romans are thinking, nope. But then when it happens, when they get the order, oh, break the man's legs, that way he can't hold himself up and he asphyxiates tonight, and get him buried before dark. Well, they went out and broke the legs, and the crucifixion was over in just a few minutes, basically. And, then they're going, wait a minute, he died today. He's in paradise today? Like Jesus said, leaves open the question. Well, if he predicted that part, could he be right in the other? And that is the implication that Luke wrote this for, is to tell the Roman court something about heaven that they can't know for certain, but is implied because the man died that day. Starting at verse 44. It was now the 6th hour, and darkness came over the whole world until the 9th hour, for the sun stopped shining, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." When he had said this, he breathed his last. The centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, "Surely this was a righteous man." When all the people who had gathered to witness this sight saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away. But all those who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. Now, the Romans knew the 6th hour. 6th hour was noon. It doesn't go dark at noon. The sun stopped shining. That is a celestial sign to the Romans. Something significant spiritually is going on if the sun stops shining. It didn't mean quite as much to the Jews, but even they understood that God controlled the sun and that human beings didn't control the sun at all. So therefore, it was a celestial event that had some sort of portent. They didn't have as much meaning into it as the Romans did. But the Roman centurion, when he saw the sun quit shining for 3 hours during the brightest part of the day, he knows something's afoot. And when Jesus is in full control of his voice, is able to talk, is able to say things, and then just suddenly dies. He doesn't die of asphyxiation. He'd been a witness to many crucifixions if he was a centurion. Probably thousands or possibly tens of thousands. He knew the signs of somebody dying of crucifixion. This was not it. This was something different. This was something unusual, novel, new, unique. He had never seen this before. He saw some evidence at that point in time. And as the Roman official at the scene, therefore testifying this, he was basically making an official proclamation that Jesus was indeed some sort of righteous man, some sort of godly man, some sort of somebody to be concerned about spiritually. And he testified. Some of the other accounts account that he said this was the son of a god or the son of God. The witnesses are a little bit different about whether he exact what tense he used in the Greek or the Latin that he spoke, whether he was saying this was a son of a god or the son of the god or something close to that. Of course, probably partly people remembered what they wanted to hear out of that. Partly he may not have been real audible either, and people may the slight difference in wording may not have carried well. And but this official who was in charge of the crucifixion, all the men that were leading the crucifixion, doing the crucifixion, recognized that Jesus died differently, and it wasn't a typical crucifixion death. He did not, lose the ability to maintain his breath and then struggle for breath and pass out, and then as he passed out, his body would struggle to get breath until he died. No, he was conscious, he was talking, he was articulate, and then he was dead. He literally had the authority to give his life up. This wasn't a committing of suicide. He didn't do damage to himself. His spirit just simply left. And the Roman centurion recognized this was not a natural phenomenon. This was not death by crucifixion in the classical sense, but that he died on the cross from crucifixion, but he died by supernatural means. And he recognizes that and exclaims it and testifies to it. And the Roman government would recognize his testimony meant something, that he was somebody who knew what a normal death was, and that Jesus' death was not a normal death, and that he recognized it was not. And that Jesus was able to speak in a loud voice right before he died. That is not somebody who is dying of asphyxiation. He died from his own hand, not in the sense of committing damage to himself in suicide, but he had the authority for his spirit to leave his body and his body to die. Because he had that authority, he also had the authority when he chose then to bring his body back to life, bring his spirit back into his life, into his body, and make it live again. And so he had the power and authority to resurrect himself. That's implied here in the crucifixion and how it's said. And Luke is setting that up so that after the resurrection, it's obvious that Jesus did it himself. And we'll get to that next week. We're not going to have time to get to it tonight. But Luke does mention at this point that it wasn't just the crowd that was angry with him. They might have, after Jesus did, started going back, well, the spectacle's over, he's dead, we've met our objective, it's time to get back to work, it's time to do our normal life. But his disciples, his followers, were still there, still mourning. Now that his death was there and they had not seen the miraculous Messiah break in and raise up a miraculous army and defeat the Romans. They were distraught. Some of them were probably hoping till he breathed his last that they were fixing to see a miracle, and that the start of the revolution where the Messiah overthrew the Roman Empire was fixing to happen. Well, it did in one sense. The Roman Empire was not conquered by an army. It was taken over by a religious thought, a religious philosophy, that this man they crucified in Palestine, in Jerusalem, was indeed the Son of God and the Messiah, the Christ, the Anointed One, the Lord of Lords, and he raised himself from the dead on the third day. And within about 400 years, all of the Roman Empire essentially would be Christian. And within 300 years, it would be officially Christian. At the time of Constantinople, it was only about 50% of the people were Christian. He was very expeditious in changing which religion he believed to lead the empire. It was getting to the point where if you fought Christianity, you were going to lose, and Christianity was gaining. Everybody else was losing. And so, very rapid as far as a change of thought in those days and times. Very rapid overtake of the Roman Empire by Christianity. And it conquered not by might of arms, but by the might of an idea, that you could have salvation and eternal life in Jesus Christ. And so they witnessed those things. They mourned. They didn't see the victory the way they thought they were going to see a victory. That's going to happen in the third day. But they were not comprehending that. And they were distraught. They were mourning. They were beating their breasts, doing all the cultural norms that somebody in mourning did, crying and wailing and etc. They knew Jesus was dead. This isn't, they were confused. They knew that Jesus was dead. Now, verse 50. Now there was a man called Joseph, a member of the council, a good and upright man who had not consented to their decision and action. He came from the Judean town of Arimathea, and he was waiting for the kingdom of God. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body. Then he took it down, wrapped it in linen cloth, and placed it in a tomb cut in the rock, one in which no one had yet been laid. It was preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph and saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it. Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes, but they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment. So Luke is telling the Romans about Jewish custom. They might have been vaguely familiar with it, but it's important for the Romans to know that the crucifixion happened the day before the day of rest, the Sabbath. It was the preparation day, the day that they got ready to rest, because the custom was you did no work then. Oh, you were allowed to cook, but most people in first century Palestine had decided that cooking was laborious work, and therefore you couldn't cook either. So they fixed the food on preparation day. They swept the house. They got all the clothes ready. A lot of our customs that we do on Sunday now, dress in our best clothes, eat our fanciest meals, etc., come from the same kind of tradition. And you fixed it on the day before the day of rest. You did all your work then. You worked twice as hard. You cooked all the meals for Friday and Saturday then. you ate your Friday meals, and you left the rest of it over till the next day, so that then on the day of rest, all you had to do was eat. You didn't have to fast, but you also didn't have to work. And they didn't go out in the fields. There was some chores that are going to have to be done on any day on an agricultural society. I mean, water has to be drawn for the animals, feed has to be put out, um, etc. Eggs have to be found, cows have to be milked. I mean, there's certain things you just got to do every day. You can't tell Bessie, it's the day of rest, I'll be back tomorrow. No, that doesn't work. She's got to be milked today. You can milk her again tomorrow, but she's got to be milked today. And so, chores like that happen, but everything they could put off, they did. And, so it was preparation day. Joseph of Arimathea. Now, it's interesting that Luke calls him a member of the council, but he didn't consent to their decision. The thing was, the day before, he had been on the council. And so to the Romans, he was still a council member, even if he had been removed from office that day. He did not consent to their actions. That's part of what the high priest had done, is he'd been pulling politics all year to get new people elected that were favorable to him. And Luke did say it was a unanimous decision. So that means Joseph of Arimathea was no longer on the council that day, but he had been the day before and hadn't agreed with their decisions and had been kicked off the council. But Pilate probably didn't follow the intricacies of who was on the council today after the new appointments and who was no longer on the council. He would have known Joseph of Arimathea to be a wealthy man, influential man. He would have known him to be on the council, and that he came and asked for Jesus' body was significant. Publicly wanting to bury the body. Luke does not go into a lot of the evidence that the others do that Pilate asked for that makes sure that Jesus was indeed dead and all the other events around it. He just simply says Joseph asked for the body and Pilate gave it to him, and then Joseph went and buried it. This new tomb which nobody had been laid in. The Jewish burial custom there in Palestine is a wealthy man that was new wealth would dig a tomb, and it could be a family tomb. It was generally an artificial cave and took a lot of work, several months' work for a fairly large crew of men to dig back into the cliff face in the limestone. And it would have, in the first room, benches that would be large enough to hold a body, and the dead body would be laid there in a burial shroud with its spices on it so that it didn't smell bad. And it would be left on that bench till it rotted and was basically bones. And then, after several months, then a designated member of the family would go in and gather those bones up and put them in a stone jar or a pottery jar if the family wasn't as wealthy anymore. And on the outside of that jar, their name and identifying information would be written, and that jar would be set back in a room behind the first room. that jar would sit there for years or decades or even centuries until those bones decayed to where they were basically falling apart. And then the equivalent member of the family at that time, which would be, years and years in advance, and the original member that put the bones in that jar would be in a jar himself in there somewhere, would take that jar and take all the remains and put it in a smaller box, smaller uh, jar, um, that would then have your name permanently engraved in it, and that would be set further back. If they, if it was a fairly large and wealthy family, there would be a third room in the back, and that's where all the small little boxes would be. Now, those boxes were pretty much uh, set sizes, uh, so that, and they had no feet or anything like that. It was just pretty much square, rectangular boxes, so they fit as tight as possible, and they would be set in there, and literally thousands of members of the family could be buried back there. Um, and the person who transferred the bones from the first jar to the second, uh, if some bone hadn't been uh, disintegrated enough to fit in the second box, part of his job was to break it up so it fit. And all that remained of you would be just a few scraps in this little box. And the box would be kind of packed full of bone fragments and stuck in the back. Um, and, that was their custom. Well, they used these graves, these tombs, for literally centuries. In fact, the tomb that Abraham cut and for his wife is still there. 4,000 years later. Um, it's now revered. It's not a continually used tomb anymore. But you know, if in one sense his family had lived there the whole time and was still um, living there and wasn't famous, they would still be burying people in that tomb. That's the way that they use tombs. And, you know, you, you didn't normally make a new tomb. Uh, you know, in our Western system, you bury people in a new burial plot. And, you know, when the cemetery gets full, you don't dig up the bodies and scoot them in tighter and rebury people in the same grave. No, you just leave them there. You say, cemetery's full. Yeah, cemetery might buy some land around it, expand, bury more people, but you know, you leave that body right there. That wasn't the way they did it, and so a new tomb that had never been used was a very special thing, and normally it was reserved for the man who paid to dig it. Um, the implication is this was Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. He was wealthy, he'd been on council, he had the authority to bury somebody there. Um, it had never been used, so apparently he had dug it so that he would be the first one buried in it. And therefore it would be named after him. That was the whole reason you dug a new tomb. So your whole family would be buried in it for all time to come, so to speak. But they would name it after the guy that dug it, that was wealthy enough to do so. It was a sign of wealth, and it was a lasting testimonial to your family that they came from somebody important. And Here Jesus is being buried in his tomb, and the man that paid for it is honoring him that much that he's giving up the right to be the first person buried in his tomb. Almost unheard of. Um, and he's the one making the decision. That shows how much Joseph thought of Jesus and what honor he paid him. That he was put into a brand new tomb that had never had anybody in it before. He was basically adopting him into the family. Um, allowing him to be buried in the family tomb that's going to be used for centuries. And the assumption, of course, that Joseph was making is his bones are going to be the first box in there, the first urn in the back, the first urn in the first box in the very back, and for centuries to come, he's going to be recognized as the first person buried in this tomb. Joseph's still going to get to be the first guy that has those honors. Jesus is going to show him some new tricks, so to speak. The women that wanted to anoint the body and treat it right, they don't have time to get that done. It's the day of preparation, but as soon as it gets dusk, they can't travel. They can't do work, because then it's the day of rest. As soon as it gets dark, as soon as it gets dusky, and as soon as the sun goes down. And all they have time to do is see where the body is, and they can go home and wait for the first day of the week. And they have to be ready. Now, the implication is they already have spices because people died all the time. You had to keep them on hand because you didn't know when they were going to die. Just like today, you have no idea when somebody's going to die. Yeah, there's some cases where we can see it coming ahead of time and prepare for it, but then there's always, so to speak, the bus that blindsides you as you walk across the street. And so every family kept something ready to bury their dead in case something just happened. And let's face it, in that day and time, people died of sore throats. You got a sore throat, you woke up with a scratchy throat, you went to bed that night feeling really terrible, you woke up the next day with a high fever, and you could be dead the next day. 2 or 3 days after you got a sore throat. People died of boils. Pimple got infected and became a boil, and then it became a systemic bloodborne infection, and they died of, a boil. And again, that could be 2 or 3 days. People died of diseases and would come down with, flu or whatever and die in a few days. So you had to keep things on hand because you didn't always have the ability to go run out to the marketplace and buy what it took to bury a body at the last minute. You might be doing other things. You might need your money to, hold the feast for the wake and stuff at that point in time. So it's things you couldn't store ahead of time. So people tend to store spices. So they went back to their house and prepared the spices. They were already stored, already ready to be used. It wasn't like they were taking the spices out and having to grind them in powder and work hard. No, they were going on the closet shelf and pulling it down and going, okay, I'll set it by the front door so that Monday morning or Sunday morning when I get to chance to get out again, I can go take care of the body. That's what they were doing. And then, so they watched to see where the body was, and then they went back home to pull the spices out. And that's, their burial custom. The Romans would have understood this. It's similar to what the Romans did. The Romans tended to build mausoleums. They didn't have good hillsides that were easy to dig into. Other places in the Roman Empire, it was possible to dig into the hillsides, and it was done. Romans knew about it. Romans understood the customs, at least in general form. Um, it varied slightly from place to place, exactly what you did, but you know, similar things were done all over the Roman Empire. They would have understood this sketchy account that the body was being put in a brand new tomb. They knew that was special. They knew how much Joseph of Arimathea respected Jesus, um, and how expensive it was. They understood the women getting spices, getting it ready for burial. So, they know that the locals know that Jesus is dead. This is, uh, Luke is describing sufficient evidence. Now, some of the other Gospels uh, give evidence that the Romans used, such as the Romans had this technique that they learned on the battlefield. When you went out to see who was dead, um, they developed this test that was fairly reliable. You stabbed in the heart with a spear, and if blood ran out, then they'd been alive before you stabbed them in the heart with a spear, but they were dead now. You obviously didn't do that to a Roman soldier that you were concerned about. You took him back to camp and you hoped. If you were pretty convinced he was dead, then you buried him anyway, but you didn't test to see if he was dead. If he was an enemy soldier, you tested to see if he was dead. And if you stabbed him in the heart and he wasn't dead, well, he's dead now. If, on the other hand, the blood had begun to congeal and coagulate when you stabbed the heart, the serum would have risen to the top. The blood cells, the red blood cells, would have fallen to the bottom, and you'd get this thick red layer on the bottom that looked like blood, and a clear layer on the top that looked like water. And if both water and blood flew out, they knew the person was dead. And if they wanted to test if somebody was dead on the cross, that's what they did. Because if their heart had already stopped and the blood was starting to separate, water and blood flowed out, yeah, they were dead, bury them. If blood flowed out, oh, they were still alive, leave them up there till we know they're dead. Well, Jesus was already dead when they tested him. This greatly surprised Pilate, and that allowed him, though, to declare Jesus dead and let Joseph of Arimathea have the body. Let's face it, Pilate knew that if water and blood flowed out, he was dead. And if blood had flowed out, well, let the blood quit flowing and he will be dead, and then I can let the body go too. But the Romans had tested him. He was dead. Joseph got the body, got it buried. He met the Jewish burial customs. He got it done before evening, before the day of rest, before the Passover, High Holy Sabbath of Passover, which would have been a abomination to leave the body up there. That's why the riot had happened the year before. Pilate left all those 100 men up there in agony during the High Holy Day of Passover and the Sabbath afterwards. And that caused, he was sacrilege. Well, he got the body down and buried, and he got it done in time that Jesus' body was buried before dark. And the implication is Joseph of Arimathea got home in time, that he didn't break the Sabbath. So, the Romans know that Jesus is dead. All kinds of conspiracy theories you hear today that have been developed in the century since, that, oh, Jesus was in a deep swoon. No, he wasn't. When the Romans stabbed him, he was dead already. And if he hadn't been, he would have been. The Roman technique of testing for death was ingenious, because it not only allowed you to know he was dead, if you weren't sure and they weren't dead yet, they were now. The Romans were efficient. I'll grant them that. Their tests for death, if you weren't dead yet, you were going to be. And that they developed that on the battlefield, testing enemy soldiers. They didn't want them going back and maybe their healers could heal somebody, and next year we might be fighting the same guy again. No, if your body on the battlefield and you can't get back to your own lines, when we go out to test, we'll find out if you're dead, and if you're not, you will be. Pretty efficient, and they had taken that same test to the crucifixions, and when it was legally needed to be known, was this guy dead? Stabbed the heart, water and blood flowed out. They knew he was dead, and they could release the body. And he was buried, and the Romans knew he was dead. So Luke has testified that about his trial, about his crucifixion, and that Jesus was truly dead, and that he was buried, and he was buried according to proper custom. So we know that Jesus did indeed die. He was human, and he died. He gave up his spirit. That was part of his divine nature. He could give it up. I mean, you and I can't just decide, oh, I'm going to give up my life right now and just plop over dead. We don't have that authority. We don't have that. We have, if we're going to commit suicide, we have to do something to our body to destroy it. Jesus didn't have to do that. His body was capable of living longer, but he gave it up. He gave his spirit up and died. And because he had that authority, then when it was time, he could also bring his spirit back into his body and resurrect the body. And we look forward to him being the first fruits and us being the ones that come after that he will indeed raise us up in the last day. Not some sort of spiritual resurrection, but literally our bodies raised back to life. Let's face it, the bodies from first century Palestine, they've rotted, they've decayed, they've gone back to atoms. Those atoms have been recirculated throughout the earth, and they've become other living things, probably other people, probably multiple times by now. And yet still God will be able to pull them back together and make their body again and resurrect it. In fact, there's probably people, multiple Christians, that when he raises them on the altar, have had some of the same atoms used in their body, and this guy's body, and that guy's body, and that guy's body, and so on. And God will be able to raise all those bodies, whether he creates new atoms or what. I don't know, and I don't care. He's going to put our bodies back together. And it's going to be us in this physical flesh, with our spirit in it, with our soul in it. And we're going to be living again. It's a physical resurrection. And we look forward to that. Gracious Lord, we do look forward to that time when you will be raising the dead. You were the first fruits. You laid your life down. Your spirit left your body. And you raised yourself again from the dead by putting your spirit back into the body to show us that it can be done and will be done. You promise it's going to happen. We look forward to that. Lord, help us to lift you up, that you would draw men to you. In your precious name. Amen. And hope to see you Wednesday. And for those of you who will be at church tomorrow, I hope to see you at church tomorrow.